We may be done with SG-1000 coverage, but the spirit lives on here on Game Boy Works episode 126.
I'm your #1 fan.
A compile game originally developed for MSX, ported to an underpowered Z80-based platform? What is this, an SG-1000 game?
Well, no, we're done with SG-1000. But that system's spirit lives on in a way through Godzilla for Game Boy. A game that is probably not what most American kids expected when they purchased this cartridge in early 1991, but instead owes its existence to the work Compile did on what were for us esoteric home systems of the early 80s. Not that kids buying NES and Game Boy games were paying all that much attention to developer credits, but either way, they could have been forgiven for assuming Godzilla for Game Boy was going to be something else entirely. After all, Toho had very recently published another Compile-developed Godzilla, Monster of Monsters for NES, which, while clumsy, was very much the sort of thing you'd really have expected from a Godzilla game. Godzilla for NES took the form of a ponderous belt scroller in which you controlled a massive sprite of either Godzilla or Mothra slugging your way across alien landscapes to beat down alien hordes, and eventually other kaijuu. It was big and dumb and pretty frustrating, but it managed to convey the scale of Godzilla surprisingly well given the NES's limitations. This is not that game. Instead, it's a puzzle platform type affair, because this is Game Boy. I'd call it a single-screen puzzle action game if it didn't scroll, but in fairness, it only scrolls because the Game Boy's resolution is so poor. The spirit of the thing is here, and said spirit is the kind of games Compile made as a matter of course for SG-1000 and MSX. Think Hustle, Chumi, and Seeso. Simple, but not necessarily simplistic, with enough texture to keep things interesting. More to the point, Godzilla effectively works as a spiritual sequel to Godzilla-kun, a 1985 MSX puzzler based on a line of cute character merchandise Toho sold throughout the mid-80s. This also explains why Godzilla for Game Boy feels completely disconnected from contemporary films. It's based on the Showa-era Godzilla series. Godzilla at this point has been around for nearly 70 years, and it has been many, many things in that time. Even within the 20 years that the Showa-era movies spanned, it constantly changed. The original 1954 movie was a sort of post-war catharsis for Japan, a parable for the atomic bomb that some culture critics claim helped a devastated populace process their collective trauma and begin to move beyond the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even if that's ascribing too much power to a movie starring a guy in a rubber costume smashing up miniature buildings, at the very least Godzilla was a movie with a message, even as it pushed the state of cinematic special effects works forward, and helped cement Japan's film industry as a creative force to be reckoned with. Godzilla lay dormant in the ice for almost a decade after his first sequel, though, until Toho managed to talk RKO into letting them license the original giant movie monster, King Kong, to create a cinematic crossover between nations, King Kong vs. Godzilla. That film's international success brought Godzilla roaring, or screonking, back into the mainstream. At that point, Toho casually created the world's first cinematic universe by bringing Godzilla into conflict with all the giant monsters the company had created in the decade between Godzilla Raids Again and King Kong vs. Godzilla, beginning with humanity's protective insect deity, Mothra. At this point, Godzilla became basically an annual series, with the exact nature and tone of the films changing from one to the other. Was Godzilla a wrathful avatar of the wounded Mother Earth? A loving father to a dopey son living together with all the other giant monsters on a secluded island? A defender of humanity against alien threats? Well, he was all of these things. And the movies themselves tended to be all over the place as well, ranging from the all-out conflict of Destroy All Monsters, the painful clip show kitty cheese of All Monsters Attack, the lurid psychedelia of Godzilla vs. Hedorah. By the mid-70s, Godzilla had petered out as a cinematic concern, becoming more of a pop culture touchstone. Hence the character Goods line, which saw Toho attempting to make Godzilla cute enough to compete with Sanrio's Hello Kitty brand. At the same time, Toho decided to reboot Godzilla with more contemporary effects, leading to 1984's The Return of Godzilla. But despite technically having been launched in the Showa era, Japan's Showa era spanned an enormous period of time from 1926 to 1989, The Return of Godzilla had nothing to do with the fun, campy films of the 60s and 70s. Instead, it adopted the more serious tone of the 1950s original, working as a direct sequel to those more somber films. The return of Godzilla launched an entirely new line of movies, the Heisei films, which ignored the continuity of the previous 2 decades in favor of a totally new ongoing storyline. Godzilla for Game Boy has nothing to do with those new movies, which, by arriving in Japan in December 1990, landed dead center between the 1989 premiere of Godzilla vs. Biollante and the December 1991 debut of Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. Although it could seem a little strange in hindsight that Toho would publish a game that had very little to do with the movies it was promoting at the time, consider the audience and the context of portable gaming in 1990 and 91. Game Boy was largely directed at kids, and kids didn't necessarily know modern-day Godzilla nearly as well as they did Showa-era Godzilla. In America especially, Godzilla had become a fixture of afternoon weekend matinee television. In the age before streaming video, or even affordable VHS tapes, evenings were for primetime, weekday afternoons were for soap operas, and Saturday and Sunday afternoon were for flipping through the UHF band to kill time with corny old movies dredged up from the studio archives. On any given Saturday in the afternoon in the 1980s, it's a pretty safe assumption that someone at a local TV station somewhere was broadcasting an old Godzilla dub, and that a passel of preteens had their eyes glued to the set in anticipation of giant monsters duking it out at terrible cost to the tiny cityscapes at their feet. Godzilla was iconic, and the monsters he battled during the Showa era were familiar sights to the Game Boy's audience. So, Compile made a great choice in creating a new iteration of their MSX interpretation of Toho's Showa-era character goods tie-in. This game plays almost exactly like Godzilla-kun for MSX, with Godzilla scrambling up and down vines and ladders to smash his way through rocks and enemies. If you are expecting these kaijuu to look anything like their on-screen counterparts, as you might well assume based on both the box art and the in-game attract mode, well, you're in for a surprise. These monsters are adorable, chunky little caricatures of themselves. Also, Godzilla has no tail smash, no atomic breath. Instead, his sole form of attack is punching rocks with a fist as large as his body. You can also punch out every foe except King Ghidorah and Hedorah, who, as you might expect based on how well they fared in their cinematic battles with Godzilla, are invincible here. More importantly though, you can punch every boulder you find to propel it forward. Oh yes, you guessed it. Did you think even the mighty Godzilla could defend himself from the dreadful might of Sokoban? Not a chance. Actually, if we're being precise, this Godzilla game owes more to Flappy specifically than to Sokoban in general. Here, as in Flappy, you need to push rocks around in order to solve puzzles and complete stages. Punch a rock into a monster and you'll crush the monster. Punch a rock against an immovable object, like a wall, and you'll crush the rock to dust. This is actually your goal in each stage. Pummel every single rock. The enemies you have to fight and wade through exist as distractions, not targets. You don't have to hurt a single monster, let alone destroy all monsters, in order to advance to the next stage. Instead, you crush rocks until there are no more rocks to crush. At which point Alexander weeps. No, actually, once smashed, one or more of those rocks will reveal an arrow icon. Touch an arrow and you'll advance to the next stage, or possibly be taken to a previous stage. Now this isn't some sort of Atlantis no Nazo blind trickery, where you will unexpectedly be warped back dozens of stages if you complete a level the wrong way. The arrows clearly indicate your progression. The direction of an arrow icon corresponds to your progression through the in-game map. Said map is more of a chart really, an 8x8 grid in which you start at the upper left corner, stage 1, and need to advance through the map square by square until you reach the space containing your objective. Sadly, said objective is Minilla, the horrible son of Godzilla, which is not really a prize worth all this effort. Thankfully, the journey is a lot more appealing than the destination in this case. Godzilla for Game Boy is one of the best examples of this genre we've seen so far in the system. Maybe the best. Certainly it feels a lot less punishing and arbitrary than something like Pre-Primitive Princess, and it moves at a speedier clip than the likes of Boxel, Flappy Special, or Psyraid. The introduction of the map mechanic adds a lot of additional appeal to Godzilla, turning it into something almost but not quite akin to an exploratory platformer. It's all broken into 64 standalone stages, but figuring out where you need to go, hint it's a space somewhere in the center of the map, and how to get there requires more thought than simply hammering your way through puzzles. There's a little experimentation required, and a touch of trial and error as you try and map out the way through the stages. There are many ways to reach the stage where Minilla and his punchable little face await you, but revealing the icon that moves you in the direction you want in a given stage may require some clever puzzle solving. This is, after all, a game where you can't jump, only climb, and the objects you need to smash apart often serve as platforms to scramble toward harder to reach rocks. It's definitely the kind of game where you find yourself scrambling for the retry menu on a regular basis, but it never really feels frustrating or unfair about it. When you screw up, you can be confident that it was indeed a legitimate goof on your part that you need to work through next time. The action can become fairly repetitive, but that is why the good Lord gave us passwords for playing in small increments. That makes this the perfect Game Boy game, really. It's a sprawling adventure built from dozens of tiny self-contained pieces. It has a leisurely pace and doesn't demand tons of twitch skill, despite the presence of some moderate conflict. Even then, Godzilla has a life meter to allow him to just tramp through his more resilient foes if he ends up cornered. The puzzles demand clever spatial thinking and the ability to strategize in terms of time and sequential actions, too. The simple graphics read cleanly on the Game Boy screen, and above all, it's based on familiar characters, even if they don't look quite like you remember them from all those Saturday matinees on Channel 34. A great game by a great studio based on a great property, Godzilla is a rare treat.
Another obscure Kemco developed RPG based on a game engine they borrowed from someone else? What is this, a Nintendo Switch game?
But no, Nekojara Monogatari is, as you might have guessed from its inclusion in Game Boy Works, a Game Boy game. However, you can certainly see a bit of modern-day Kemco at work here. Just as most of Kemco's modern-day output consists of simple role-playing games that appear to have been built in RPG Maker, Nekojara Monogatari is a simple role-playing game built once again on the bones of ICOM Simulation's Shadowgate. We've already seen this idea in action once before with Sword of Hope, way back in the early days of Game Boy Works. Nekojara pulls the same trick, taking the windowed interface and text parser command system that Kemco discovered while converting Shadowgate and Deja Vu to NES, and overhauling it to lean toward turn-based role-playing rather than point-and-click adventuring. Nekojara works more or less identically to Sword of Hope, which is no bad thing. It's rudimentary as RPGs go, but it holds up a lot better now than the likes of Aretha or Oni do, because at least it's different than your usual grind-heavy Dragon Quest light fare. Not to mention the fact that it doesn't compete directly and end up demolished by Final Fantasy Legend II. There were quite a few fresh new RPGs to choose from in December of 1990, at least if you were based in Japan, and Nekojara Monogatari seems like it would have been the preferred backup choice if Final Fantasy Legend II, or rather Saga II, was sold out. Nekojara Monogatari also has a second, somewhat unique element working in its favor. As the title suggests, it's a cat-themed RPG. From what I can tell, there's something of an isekai element to the storyline, as the protagonist, that's you, the player, finds himself transformed into a cat in a world of intelligent cats. I've had a really difficult time finding any substantial information on this game online, including in Japanese, so I can't really say just how deeply it goes into the whole cat-themed thing. I can say that without being able to fully read the text, it's pretty much just your typical JRPG, done up in the Sword of Hope style. I mean, the healing items are kitty treats, but they're still healing items, and they work more or less the same way as in any other RPG. Based on the few Japanese text commentaries I was able to find online, Nekojara Monogatari does seem to have a few interesting mechanics, unless I'm totally misreading the details. For one thing, it appears to have some sort of mechanic called stress that builds up over time and affects your combat efficacy. Also, it seems like defeating certain cat enemies will cause encounter rates to drop in a specific area. But don't quote me on those claims. Like I said, there is no English language breakdown of Nekojara Monogatari that I can find anywhere, and even Japanese bloggers tend to regard the game with glancing curiosity of that. It seems a shame because, from what I've been able to play, it feels reasonably solid, a decent battery-backed RPG that plays a lot like Sword of Hope. Kemco has only reissued Nekojara Monogatari once, about a decade ago on 3DS Virtual Console, and there are no English language fan translations available for it as of yet. With any luck, the renewed interest in Game Boy, precipitated by the arrival of the Analog Pocket, will rustle up some enterprising hackers to bring this quirky little adventure to the English-speaking world. Until then, we'll just have to settle for it being one of the more enticing entries in the Japanese-only Game Boy library.
Next time on Game Boy Works, do not feed this video after midnight.